Absolutely. We are on week 3 and finishing up this series that we've called Beyond Politics, where I think the name can scare us, the logo can scare us, like whatever, but this series isn't partisan, it isn't policy-based, it isn't politic-based. All we're talking about is recognizing the anxiety that exists in our culture based on where we are with election season coming up, recognizing the divisiveness that surrounds us, the frustration that surrounds us, all of that narrative, and how do we as Christians live in the middle of that is all that we're discussing. Because as United Methodists, we believe that we can take our faith very seriously, that we can look at our life and everything in it through a biblical lens, through the lens and the picture of Jesus, and in all sorts of different parts of our life, draw different conclusions. We can still seriously look through the story of Scripture and draw different conclusions about how we ought to act in any given situation, which then inevitably is going to include how we act in the midst of our civic responsibility. And that's okay. We welcome that, in fact, because it means that we are going to help one another if we carry the right intentions. And so we've been taking this idea and recognizing just how hard it can be right now, and trying to provide hope and encouragement in the middle of all of that. And the framework for these discussions has been around John Wesley's 3 rules for voting. So John Wesley was the founder of Methodism, and when he was asked as an English person during the American Revolution, what do we do when it comes to our vote? How are we to behave? Can you please give me some advice? And here's what John Wesley offered in a letter written in 1774. He said, "Vote without fee or reward. Do not speak ill of whom you vote against. Do not let your heart sharpen toward those who voted differently." So we've been talking about how can we carry our civic duty with integrity, not just considering ourselves, but also considering what's best for others. I'd like to think that not too terribly many of you that vote without fear or reward doesn't apply directly, because I'm probably assuming most of you aren't bribed, but I think that we can take that to another level, which says, how can I also look out not just what's best for me, but what's best for my neighbor? And last week we talked about what I said I think is the toughest of these 3 rules to follow, which is do not speak ill of whom you vote against, because it feels like a removed target. It feels like something that's further away from me, and so the way that we talk about it doesn't really matter. Plus, when you factor in the reality that that's become normalized by our culture, by the media, by the people running the campaigns themselves and beyond. That's just normal. So it feels like it's okay because we have somehow accepted that. But we recognize that this simply just isn't the way of Jesus. And we can rise above it while still carrying differences among one another. And this week, if that was the hardest, this week we're talking about what is the most important, which is to not let our hearts sharpen toward those who vote differently. And if we don't follow rules 1 and 2, we will naturally not follow the 3rd. I think you can follow rules 1 and 2 and not follow the 3rd, but if we certainly don't do number 1 or number 2, then number 3 becomes really, really easy trap to fall into. But this is relational. This is all relational, not with someone that we see on the TV or in the news, but this is with how I deal with the person sitting next to me, in front of me, behind me, the person I work with, the person I go to church with, on and on. Which is why this one is the most important. And I remember when I was growing up as a kid, I was exposed to politics in the way that most kids are, right? Yard signs, political ads on TV, whatever. You don't really know what it means. Nobody at 6 or 7, apart from maybe Pastor Craig, is really that interested in that type of stuff. And so you just know that it's there, but you don't really know what it's about. You know what I mean? And I think also when I was growing up, the culture that I was at least exposed to, it doesn't mean that this was the way that the holistic culture was, but the culture that I was exposed to was that our political opinions and perspectives were held tight to the chest, right? We know that it's not dinner conversation, that it's not first date conversation or whatever, but it would go even deeper than that, that we would hold our opinions tied to our chest. I would see my parents and how they interacted with all this. I remember my mom on Sunday mornings getting ready for church would watch Meet the Press on Sunday mornings, and that was probably my deepest exposure. Did I pay any attention to it? Not a bit, but I knew that it was there because every single Sunday morning this is what she was watching. And my parents chose to raise me in a household where I recognize the political realm, but I could not have told you where my parents would have stood on not just what party, but even when it came down to policy. See, because as a kid, what you don't see is the nuance that's necessary for policies and things like that. What do you see immediately? You see sides, right? You see that there's this side and there's that side. And I feel blessed that I was not sure what my parents would have identified themselves or classified themselves as, because what would I have gravitated toward then as a child? Whatever side that was, regardless of what their reasoning was for doing that, right? It would have just been an identity without any reason for that identity. And so I was able to grow up and understand these questions and what the differences were and why they mattered. But I began to recognize that through this blessing that I didn't see things through a partisan lens necessarily, because it wasn't about, am I on this side or that side? Is this the right side or is this the wrong side? And I think in not talking about it, though, there's good things and bad things that come with that, right? The good thing is we're going to say, we're not going to let this conversation get in the way of my relationships, right? I'm not going to let this difficult thing stymie my friendships, stymie my family, whatever, so we just hold on to it. The bad side of that is this. All of those opinions and perspectives and ideas are still held by all the people that you know and love. They're not any different, right? You just don't necessarily know about it. And so what we say by taking the perspective of kind of the temptation of complete withdrawal is we kind of say, well, I don't want anything to disqualify me from relationship with other people. And I don't want anything from somebody else to disqualify them from relationship with me. So we're already putting boundaries around what kind of friends we can have and what kind of friends we can't have. And our engagement in these types of conversations is so vital, because if we just entirely withdraw, which is so tempting and so easy because the rhetoric is just difficult. And so it's easy to be like, I'm just not with any of that. And so we disengage entirely. The problem with that is that there's no opportunity for growth, no opportunity for change. Everything is simply in opposition to how I have always felt, without any understanding of humanity from anybody else. Withdrawal is tempting, but it doesn't allow for any kind of reformation or growth. Engagement does allow for that. Now, here's a pro tip for you. Social media is not political engagement. Watching the news is not political engagement. Now, it might make you informed, certainly. I don't think that's a terrible thing, but it's not engagement. It's not discourse. It's not idea sharing. It's not humanity sharing with anybody else. And so the engagement, though, because of all of the things that I just mentioned, can often leave us frustrated and angry even. And so then where do we end up? We probably end up throwing our hands up and we end up withdrawing anyway. So we just don't bother. Because I don't want to be angry. You probably don't want to be angry either. No matter what we do, withdraw, we're led to division. Engagement that leaves us frustrated and angry leads to division. So what are we to do? I think that with the way of Jesus, almost always, there is always a third option. And we see a third option when we look at the life of Jesus. Because if there's one thing that we can learn from reading our scriptures, knowing the heart of God, understanding Jesus and his ministry, it is that God despises division. God despises division. Even the laws that you think about don't have anything to do with division. Take murder, for example. At the heart of murder is what? We have taken someone out of community. We have divided ourselves from someone else. That is the heart of the issue. So even the morality that feels like it doesn't have to do with unity actually does have to do with community, and it has to do with unity and sharing life together. This is God's way. The entire love and grace and work of Jesus was for the sake of unification. Jesus' final prayer before being led to the cross to be killed was, "Father, make them be one as you and I are one." So the last thing on Jesus' mind before being taken away was that if they get nothing else out of my life, if they get nothing else out of my teaching, if they get nothing else out of my ministry, may it be that they would be unified, that they would be one. Jesus' entire life was marked by this idea. And we see it all throughout the Gospels. Like one day, when Jesus begins calling his disciples, he sort of does it 1 by 1 or 2 by 2 or 3 by 3. But he calls his disciples. And one of them was a guy named Matthew. And Matthew was a tax collector. We'll get into that in a minute as to why that's important for the story. But Matthew was a tax collector, and he calls Jesus to come follow him. Matthew does. And as Jesus sort of does, he has a way about him. He ends up inviting himself over for dinner. This is just kind of how Jesus does things. He ends up at Matthew's house. And let's see what happens at Matthew's house, because it's not just Jesus and Matthew, but some other people end up there too. This is in Matthew chapter 9. You can follow along on the screen. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So the Pharisees see these people eating dinner with Jesus at Matthew's house. Like, what's going on? I have an aunt who is retired, but she worked for the IRS. And we still give her grief because she worked for the IRS. And of course, we recognize that this is sort of a whimsical digging. But today, still, nobody enjoys paying their taxes, right? In Jesus' day, a tax collector was a bigger problem than a tax collector today. I read a story recently about somebody who was talking about how their dad was a tax collector, and they were a tax collector for their little town. And they did it for years and years and years and years and years, but they had to run for the position. They had to be elected to do it, but they did it for years and years and years because nobody ever ran against them. And so nobody likes this position, but in the day, in the Hebrew mind, being a tax collector was worse. If you were a tax collector in Israel, this meant that you were likely a Jew who worked for Rome. And this was a problem because of how the Romans had historically and were treating the Jewish people. It was an imperialistic society that came and harmed them, and it was nothing good for them and only harm for them. And now you are one of us working for them. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that tax collectors for Rome would often, and famously, and it was very well known, they would take the taxes that were owed, but then they would also charge you extra and they would pocket the difference. And Rome did nothing about it. They didn't really care. It wasn't really worth their time or effort, and probably many of the officials felt like if it was one more way to take advantage of the Jews, let's go ahead and do it. And so imagine who Matthew, who Jesus has just called, would be to the people surrounding Jesus and to the Pharisees. So when we see tax collectors and sinners, this is what this means. It's sinners and sinners, right? It's thieves and sinners would be the way that they would be looking at this. Traitors and thieves and sinners is who's eating dinner with Jesus at Matthew's house. So they were hated for these reasons. And so the religious people are like, Jesus, why would, they ask the disciples, why does your teacher spend time with these people? If he were really a good Jew, he wouldn't associate with the likes of these people. These people are bad. These people are unrighteous. If he was really righteous, then he couldn't spend time with them, let alone share a meal with them, sit down in their home, actually act like you have a relationship beyond turning in our taxes. But this is just what Jesus does. And so when Jesus hears them asking this question, he responds. He doesn't let his disciples answer the question for him. I don't know if he thought maybe they'd screw up the answer, but Jesus probably felt strong enough that I'm going to speak up in the middle of this. First of all, who likes being talked about when you can hear them, right? Like asking a question to somebody else about you when you can hear it. That's kind of rude. But Jesus chimes in. And he says, it isn't the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Jesus makes it clear that there is no opinion, there is no perspective, there is no lifestyle, there is no decision, there is no identity that disqualifies you from a relationship with Jesus. He says, in fact, those are the people that I have come for. Now, here's what the Pharisees didn't recognize. When Jesus says, I have come not for the healthy, but the sick, Jesus isn't calling the Pharisees healthy in the scenario, right? The Pharisees don't recognize that they fall under the sick category because they have already deemed themselves righteous when Jesus has come to show us that there is only one righteous one, and it's Jesus. But Jesus makes it clear that nothing disqualifies anyone from relationship with him. Do you think at this dinner table at Matthew's house, with Jesus eating with all sorts of people that were outcasts, do you think that they would have agreed about everything that they talked about? I think Jesus would have offered some challenging perspectives, some difficult ideas. I don't think that agreement was necessarily what they were having for dinner. But Jesus maintained relationships with all of these people. He disagreed with all sorts of people. He disagreed with the religious folks. He disagreed with the non-religious folks. He disagreed with his closest friends. And yet Jesus maintains relationships with them because Jesus recognizes that all of us, every single one of us, are in need of the spiritual doctor Jesus. But after saying it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick, Jesus continues by quoting the prophet Hosea when he tells them this, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now, in our world, we might not recognize the power of what's meant by sacrifice, so I've offered a couple of alternatives here that might make more sense to us. What Jesus is saying here, this is my translation, is I desire grace, not perfection. I desire grace and not perfection. And Eugene Peterson, who's a deceased Presbyterian pastor, he wrote the paraphrase, the Message version of the Bible. And he puts it this way. When Jesus says this, I'm after mercy and not religion. I'm here to invite outsiders, not coddle insiders. That's really good. I'm here to invite outsiders and not coddle insiders. Think about how that speaks to the Pharisees' condition. Those are the insiders who are looking to be coddled by Jesus, who are saying, why would you spend time with people that are so different than you? They can't even wrap their minds around it. And Jesus says, I'm not here for you. If I were here for you, you would know it. Because your heart would be in such a position that you would want to receive what I have to offer you. See, our religion or our culture or however we identify ourselves in whatever sphere of our life might tell us implicitly or explicitly that there are people that we just don't associate with. That there are people on the inside and people on the outside. In other words, our world tells us there are people who are invited to Matthew's house and people who are not invited to Matthew's house. One of the reasons that we celebrate an open table for communion is because everybody is invited to Matthew's house. The tax collectors were invited to Matthew's house. The sinners were invited to Matthew's house. The Pharisees were invited to Matthew's house. They probably just stood on the outside looking through the window because they didn't want to associate, but they still wanted to gossip. But they were invited. The seat at the table would have grown for them if they wanted to come in. See, we think we have to avoid spending time with certain people because if we spend time with certain people, then we become associated with them, and worse yet, we may still become like them, but they are not us. But Jesus says that we should be drawn into relationships and conversations, even with people that are different from us. See, Jesus says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I desire grace and not perfection. And immediately after this, a couple of things happen that are significant. And when you read your scriptures, I want you to think about this. The stories of our Gospels, you may find the same story but told in a different order. Have you ever noticed that about the Gospels? You get one here that's told that it happened here, or it happened after this, or it happened after this. See, the Gospel writers aren't after this perfectly historical, chronological story. But what happens here in these couple of stories is that the author of this Gospel is trying to drive home a point. And there's a reason why these stories happen after Jesus has said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, that I desire grace and not perfection. Because what happens after this is Jesus leaves Matthew's house. And while he's walking along the way, a synagogue leader approaches Jesus and he says, my daughter is dead. I need you to come visit. I just know if you come and lay your healing touch on her that she will be healed. And so then Jesus comes and he follows this man to his home. And while Jesus is along the way, there's people following Jesus around everywhere he goes. Because if you think and you have seen that Jesus has the power to do such things, and he's about potentially to raise the dead to life, are you going to want to see? I'm going to want to see. So people are following Jesus around and they're crowding around him. And as Jesus is walking to this little girl's house, this woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And if you know anything about that within that culture, it means that she would have been an outcast. She would not have been allowed to be where she was, but she fights through the crowd. Would not have been allowed to be where she was, but she fights through the crowd, touching everyone along the way, making them ritually unclean by touching them along the way because she's bleeding. And she lunges to the ground and she thinks, if I can just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, I'll be healed. And she reaches out and she touches Jesus' robe and she's healed immediately. Jesus doesn't even know that she's there doing this until he says, some power has gone out of me. What's happened? And he encounters this woman. Keep in mind, has not just broken the law by making Jesus unclean, but has made everyone around her unclean. Not just the people that she has touched, but the people that she has touched, whoever they've touched have now become unclean because they were unclean first by this woman. Laws are being broken left and right, and this woman has the audacity to touch Jesus' robe. And how does Jesus respond? He calls her a daughter of God and says, your faith has healed you. And so along the way, after this encounter, Jesus makes his way to the home of the synagogue leader and finds the girl dead. In fact, it notes in this story in Matthew that there were pipes playing outside this person's house. That's not a weird anecdote. It's not a story about someone who's trying to play some music to make some money. It's a tradition within the culture that when someone would die, someone would play outside their house. So what the gospel writer is trying to communicate is dead as a doornail, right? That not only has she died, but we've had time to communicate to the pipers to come to the house and come play. You get it? You know, being dead makes you unclean as well. Jesus enters the house anyway, brings the little girl back to life. See, the part of us that likes following the rules, that wants to do things right and wants to be righteous, usually we feel that way out of some selfish desire because I don't want my image to be associated with something else. Because I need to be good, because I need to be right, because I need X, Y, and Z. So we think if I can just behave the right way and do the right things, then and only then will I be satisfied. But who are we satisfying in doing that according to Jesus? The only one we're satisfying in that is ourselves. Because why? Because Jesus desires mercy and not sacrifice. We think we know what's right. We think we know what is good, but Jesus shows us that our humanity is more important than that. Jesus calls us to see the humanity in others before the righteousness in ourselves. Jesus calls us to see the humanity in others before the righteousness in ourselves. Because you know what's important about these stories with Jesus is not that these people are miraculously healed, is not that Jesus has the power to do this. It's not even that Jesus has said, regardless of whether the world has said you are worthy or not, you are worthy and I will be with you. It's not even about that. What does Jesus do after encountering these people? The woman with the bleeding problem and the girl. He doesn't just heal them, but in healing them, what happens? Their relationship with the world around them has been restored. They are now back into community. They are back into a relationship with the world around them. So not only has Jesus said, you guys get over it. They are worthy of your love. They are worthy of your grace. They are worthy of your relationship. But he says, I am going to bring them back into relationship with you myself, because Jesus desires mercy and not sacrifice. The heart of Jesus was so full of grace and so full of mercy that he welcomed and invited these conversations. Jesus was not fragile. Jesus was not insecure. Jesus was not threatened. And so in this biblical scenario, it was the religious folks and their religion that they used to shield themselves from the rest of the world. They hid behind the comfort of their practices and their rituals, and it made them skeptical of relationships with anybody else. But that's what happens in this scenario. But this is just human nature. We all do this. It might not be our religion, it might be our family, it might be our job, it might be whatever identity it is that we hold. We like to hide behind it because we love what's familiar. Every single one of us, even those of us who love adventures, still love what's familiar. For the Pharisees, it was their religion. But for us, it could be our political party or persuasion. It could be our home or nationality, our interest group, or even our family. But in staying confined within our own world, we grow oh so fragile. We grow oh so insecure. Because we only are around what's familiar. We become so wrapped up in ourselves and how we do things, we forget that other people are different. We can become so short and so impatient and even angry when we're challenged with different ideas or perspectives. We don't treat people with fairness. We may say, I don't have these conversations because I just know I get so frustrated I become a ticking time bomb. Well, what's the problem there? It isn't your opinion. It isn't your perspective. It's your short temper that we need to work on. It's an insecurity that we need to work on that leads you there. But Jesus instead desires merciful relationships, that we would live and love in such a way that no one is on the outside of the scope of our love. That our connections would be wide and diverse, because the kingdom of God is wide and diverse. That we would be a people that outside of putting ourselves or our family's safety at risk, no one is disqualified from community and relationship. But because Jesus did put love and did put grace and did put unity and did put relationship with you ahead of his own safety and ahead of his own security, by showing us how far love would go on the cross, that we became united in that love, united in this cosmic grace that we all stand in need of. Instead of being a people of division and divisiveness, may we be a people who offer the same life-giving touch as Jesus to all people. Whoever it is in your mind that you may consider unclean, may we offer a life-giving touch, knowing that Jesus desires mercy and not sacrifice, grace, not perfection. Because mercy is ultimately what we're after.